If you stop for a moment and examine your daily life, you'll probably find it's full of habits. In the morning, it could be that you brush your teeth, you make a cup of coffee when you first wake up, or maybe you prepare a smoothie in just a particular way that you like to do it. It could be making the bed before you get ready for the day, or taking out the trash whenever the bin gets full, or just washing your hands. All of these are habits, and habit has been a focus of psychology all the way back to when one of its modern founders, William James, wrote about habit in a chapter in one of the first psychology textbooks in 1890. James thought that habits were essential and functional for both the individual and society. He considered it the enormous flywheel of society that keeps the fisherman and the deckhand at sea through the winter. It holds the miner in his darkness and nails the countryman to his log cabin and his lonely farm through all the months of snow. Well, even though habit is a topic that's been around for a long time in psychology, I still think we can all benefit from a review of what we actually know about the psychology of habit and how to make us more effective in our everyday life. And one of the great places to start is a book that was just published in the last couple of years. Here, a book called Atomic Habits. And in this book, James Clear does a really good job of looking over all of the literature, mainly from psychology, about how habits can be used effectively, how you can build habits, how you can keep your habits going, how you can get rid of old habits, habits that you don't want to have. And so I thought I'd go ahead and, in this video, talk about some of this research on habits in the formulation that Clear actually uses in his book. So you can build better habits by following 4 simple rules in Clear's book. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. Now, in order to develop a habit, what Clear does is he bases his approach to this on a sort of a common learning model that we've had in psychology for many decades, probably since the 1930s or 40s. And you can see it here, in which he's talking about 4 main components of any time that we have a stimulus out there and then we respond to it. And so in this elaborated version of this, you can see, first of all, we have step number 1 is a cue. Then number 2 is we have a craving to that cue. The third is that we have a response based on the craving. And then the fourth is the reward, the consequence of that behavior. So again, the idea is that there's a cue out there in the world, some stimulus, maybe it's even internal. That's followed by a craving or a motivation, a drive. And then that motivation causes us to behave in a certain way. And then the way that we decide to behave, or how we automatically behave in that moment, will then be followed by some consequence. And if it's a positive consequence, we're more likely to repeat it the next time we see that stimulus or that cue. And if it's something that leads us to have a negative consequence, we're less likely to do this. And this goes all the way back to like 100 years ago in psychology and work that Thorndike and others did on looking at how we learn simple acts like this to different kinds of stimuli. So according to James Clear, then all of our habits have to proceed through these 4 steps. And basically, these 4 simple rules map onto those 4 simple steps. So let's take the first one, make it obvious. So the point here is that if you want to establish a good habit, you need to find a way for the cue that's going to elicit that habit to be really obvious to you, something that you can't overlook, so that whenever you encounter the cue, you'll be very likely then to engage in the behavior that you want to have. So basically, you could make it very overt to yourself by saying aloud, I will do my behavior at some specific time, at some specific location. So that whenever I'm in that time or in that location, those will serve as cues. The situation that I'm in, the place I happen to be at that particular time, will be more likely then to elicit this habit that I'm trying to elicit. Before I explain this further, let's look at this study that Clear mentions in his book. It's a study that was published in the British Journal of Health Psychology by Milne et al. And you can see that we have 3 groups here. And all 3 of these groups had signed up for a 2-week exercise intervention program to help them get to exercise more. And they were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups, the control group, the motivation group, or the plan group. So the control group, what they did when they came to the laboratory for the first week, is they basically were just given some information about the fact that they were in this study, and then they were asked to go ahead and record what they were going to do over the next week. So they went ahead and just basically signed into the experiment without anything else happening, and then the experimenters were able to measure their behavior, how much they exercised the following week. In that group, how many people did actually exercise in the following week? Well, it was something like 30 to 40%. So very few people, relatively speaking, here in the control group actually did exercise the following week, even though they had signed up for an experiment hoping to increase their exercise. The second group is the motivation group. What happened in the motivation group? Well, what they were given was information, again, that they were in this experiment, but they were also given extra information about how it's really important to get good exercise, how it's good for your health, you're gonna have long-term consequences. Basically, they were just given lots of information to kind of pump them up to get them ready to want to go exercise. And then they were let go, and again, the researchers were able to measure their behavior in the following. In that group that has all of this extra information, this motivational information to keep them kind of pumped up, what percentage of them actually did exercise the following week? Well, it wasn't a whole lot different from the control group. It was almost exactly the same. So even though they were given motivational material, they had signed up for an experiment, hoped to increase their exercise, they just didn't actually increase their exercise much over the control group. Now we have the third group, and they're called the plan group. And what did happen in the plan group is that they were given the same information as in the control and in the motivation groups. That is, in the motivation group, of course, they had been given all this information about how exercise is really good for you, and that was done also as well in the plan group. But there was one additional thing that was added to the plan group. And that was, before they left, the researchers asked each participant to indicate when they planned to exercise in the following week. What time, what day, what place did they want to exercise in the next week? So basically, they had to state a plan about when they were going to exercise in the next week. And so somebody might say, well, I'm going to exercise every Monday at 8 o'clock before I go to work, whatever it was. And they had a plan. And then they let them go, and they measured their behavior for the following week. You can see close to 92% or so of the participants in that group actually did exercise in the following week. So you see, everything was the same as in the motivation group. The difference was that a specific time and location had been mentioned and had been thought about so that the participant, the person, is thinking about this habit that they want to develop, which is to exercise, but they thought about it in a very concrete, obvious way. They said, hey, 8 o'clock on Tuesday, I'll be in this one particular room. And then when it came to Tuesday at 8 o'clock and they were in that room, they were more likely then to engage in the habit. So that's the idea behind this first simple rule, that anytime you want to try to develop a habit, try to think of what is an obvious elicitor, something that would happen to cause you to be more likely to have that habit. Another thing you can do as a sort of a trick on this first step is to use what's called habit stacking. So basically in a habit stack, what you do is you say to yourself, hey, I'm going to take one habit, and when I complete it, the completion of that habit will become the stimulus for the next habit. Okay, so it's like the cue for my next habit, my new habit, is going to be the completion of the prior habit. So maybe you take some really well-established habits. So for example, you always have a cup of coffee in the morning before you do anything else. So maybe your new habit is going to be that as the coffee is brought to your lip for that final gulp, you're going to then take the cup and develop the habit of going to the dishwasher, opening it up, and putting all the dirty dishes away. So the completion of your drink of this coffee is the stimulus or the cue for the next new habit that you're trying to develop. So you're again saying this very overtly to yourself. You're like making it sure that you're consciously aware that you're doing this, that you take one kind of habit that you know you're always going to have, which is to always drink this cup of coffee, and then try to develop a new habit by using the completion of that first habit to start the new habit. So just as an example of this, you could have a morning routine in which you say that after I pour my morning cup of coffee, I'm going to meditate for 60 seconds. So maybe that's your new habit that you want to develop. After I complete my cup of coffee, I will then use that as a cue for meditating for 60 seconds. But of course, then you could use that new habit as a cue for the next habit after that. So you could stack another habit right after it, that after I meditate for 60 seconds, I will write up my to-do list for the day. And then maybe after you've completed your to-do list, that becomes a cue for another habit that you have stacked, which is that after I write my to-do list for the day, I will immediately begin my first task. So you see, we've now taken 3 habits and stacked them, where each of them has been laid on next to the next one. They've been done in a chain. This is actually a very old technique in learning that we've known about with pigeons and other animals for a long, long time. And you're just using this now powerfully to help you develop new habits based on the ones that you already have. Just as an example, you could also look at evening routine as a stack of habits. You could have, after I finish eating my dinner, I'll put my plate directly in the dishwasher. Then you could say, after I put my dishes away, I'll immediately wipe down the counter. And then after I wipe down the counter, I'll set up my coffee mug for the next morning. So you see, now we've kind of like come full circle, and you have a cup sitting out there ready for you the next morning, and then it starts the next round of the habits again, and you've just nicely stacked your habits there. So you see, by making the cue really obvious each time, it's more likely then that you're going to engage in this desired habit that you have. All right, the next point that he makes, this next simple rule, is to make it attractive. So the idea here is that once you have a cue, you need to have some desire, you need to have some craving in order to engage your habit. And in order to do that, the best thing you can do is to try to make this a pleasant thing. Try to make it a real positive experience, something that's going to give you pleasure by engaging in this habit. Because to tell you the truth, a lot of our habits are really dull. They might even be painful, like going to the gym. And so you need to find a way to make it a positive experience. And so what he does is he suggests that you use like principles of conditioning that we have in psychology to make the whole habit just in a more attractive or appealing kind of situation. So what you could say is you could say, well, I'm going to go ahead and use my habits to help me develop new needs, new motivations. And so you could say, after I complete this current habit, I will then have this habit that I need that will be taken care of. And then after I do that habit that I need, I will then engage in a habit that I want. So the difference between needs and wants is that, let's say you need to go exercise because it's really good for you. Maybe the habit that you want is to be able to spend some time going through your Instagram feed. So what you could say to yourself is, hey, I'm gonna go ahead and do my routine. I'm gonna go to the gym, and I will complete this gym routine, this gym habit. And then because I don't really want to do that, that's not the most desirable thing, I'm going to use habit stacking to stack another habit on it right afterwards that is really pleasurable. Watching, going through my Instagram feed and seeing what people have posted. So the idea again is that you're going to go ahead and take this thing that's less desirable and use habit stacking to help you make it all more desirable. So you kind of wedge in those unattractive habits, those things that don't give you a whole lot of pleasure, but you still want to do them, in between things that are actually more pleasurable. Another thing you can do to make your habit more attractive is just to try to change the context that it's happening in to make it more attractive. So for example, if going to the gym is really an unpleasant experience, maybe you can bring a gym buddy with you. Maybe you can play some really good music that you like while you're at the gym. So what you do is you try to find other kinds of cues that give you pleasure to kind of layer on top of engaging in that particular habit. So again, it's a way of just sweetening the whole thing to increase the craving to do the habit, even if the craving itself isn't directly related to the cue that's causing you to do the habit. The third step, this third simple rule here, is to make it easy. And this is where we get into the whole idea of making a response given the craving. Now, one of the big errors that James Clear points out in this book that a lot of people engage in when they want to develop a new habit is they basically shoot too high. That is, they really try to go for a big habit that they want and not realize that they're going to have to it's going to take some work to actually develop a whole set of little smaller habits in order to engage in that bigger habit. So for example, maybe your desired goal, your habit is that you want to run a marathon every year. So you just say to yourself, hey, my new habit is to run marathons. Well, you can't just decide right now after you've been laying around on a sofa all the time that you're going to start running marathons. You got to do a lot of other work in between that. You need to break it up into smaller habits that you can actually conquer. And so I know that's a really extreme example, but the point here is that you need to do this with all of your habits. Try to examine these new desired habits that you have and say, what's a realistic timeline for me to develop these habits? He has this figure in his book in which he talks about the fact that very often what's going on is we think that if I just spend a little bit more time and a little bit more time and a little bit more time in this sort of incremental way on developing new habits and new behaviors that I want to engage in, then I'm going to see a nice linear relationship. That as I keep putting a little bit more time and a little bit more time, I'm going to see there on the y-axis that I get more and more of that habit developing, just in a nice linear way. That more effort in, the more out I get. But you can see what he's trying to say is that it's probably more likely that we have sort of a learning curve here, and that it actually takes us a long time of kind of developing our habits, like a lot of trial and errors, making mistakes, not very easily getting our habit down. And then as we keep working on it, then eventually it starts to pay off in this kind of like rising slope. And then that's when we actually are going to start seeing some real effectiveness. Now, the difference, though, between that straight line and that curved line, he calls that the valley of disappointment. Because you see, in our everyday life, when we kind of try to develop new habits like this, and we don't recognize how long it takes, how much effort it really takes to develop a new habit, we're going to be disappointed a lot. You know, we're going to have this gulf here between what we think it should be happening and what is actually happening. It's not really our fault at all. It's just the way that learning happens. It doesn't happen in a nice linear fashion. And so we get stuck up in that gulf of disappointment, and we just flounder and we give up. We don't develop our good habits. So one thing you can do at this point, as following this simple rule, is to just say to yourself, give yourself a break. I'm going to take the time. It's going to take a while before I develop this good habit that I want to develop, and I won't let myself get disappointed early on because it's going to take a while for it to pay off. So another way to think of this is in another figure in his book is that if you just try to do a little bit more every day, a little bit more every day, a little bit more every day, that is, you keep working on maybe some smaller habits and getting them down first, then eventually you'll get there. And like a real simple way to do this is to think about it from the sense of, let's say you want to start going to the gym. And what you could do is you could say to yourself the very first time, instead of just going to the gym and working out for an hour and finding out that you're in a lot of pain and it's not very rewarding at all, what you should do instead is go ahead and just make it your goal that you're going to get your bag packed to go to the gym. Try to do that 3 days this week, just to pack up a bag to go to the gym. And then maybe next week what you do is you actually take the bag and you go to the gym and you sit down at a bench and you look around for a little bit. And do that for a couple times until you develop that habit. And then maybe the following week you actually get dressed at the gym and go out and maybe sit down and play with some equipment for a little bit. But you see, the point is you're just kind of gradually eking your way up, little by little bit, developing good habits. It's going to take a while just to develop the habit of going to the gym on a regular basis, let alone the number of reps you're going to do on a particular machine and how much time you want to spend there before you actually break down. So this is a good way to pull in our responses to that craving, to that cue of wanting to stimulate our new behavior, and saying, I'm going to make it more realistic, that I'm actually going to be able to conquer that. The other thing is that a lot of our habits sometimes only take like one time to actually lock them in. That is, if you really think about it carefully, some habits are really quite easy to develop if we just get over one important hurdle. Here's an example of this from looking at this table. You can see, for example, under nutrition, we have a couple examples here. Like, let's say that your goal is that you want to have better nutrition. What you could do is you could buy yourself a water filter just to clean your drinking water and know that you now have cleaner drinking water. So by buying a water filter system, you've just done one act that now makes it easier for you to develop a habit of drinking healthy water. Or it could be that you're going to just go ahead and start using small plates instead of the large plates in your cupboard. And so that when you use these smaller plates, you put less food on it. And then you'll therefore, by just always choosing to use a smaller plate, you're going to have less food. You'll consume less calories if that's your goal. For happiness, maybe it's a simple thing like just get a pet. One time only, get a pet. Boom, you've got your pet now. And now your pet can go ahead and give you happiness on a regular basis. Or maybe it's that you just need to move to a friendlier, more social neighborhood. And that in itself, just that simple act, will make it easier for you then to develop habits that lead to happiness. Or it could be that you just buy a picture that makes you smile and you mount it in a place that you see it all the time. And so this picture, maybe it's a picture that you took yourself, or it's a picture you bought at an art gallery. But the idea is you just make this one purchase, you get it framed, boom, done, hang it up. And now you've got something that's going to develop a regular place for you, a source for you to develop the habit of having happiness whenever you see it. Sleep is a tough one for a lot of people. So there's some simple things that you might do just to develop better sleeping habits. So you could just start with buy a good mattress. A lot of people sleep on mattresses that are old and cruddy and they really hurt their back. And if they just went and swapped it out with a brand new mattress, boom, they're now going to develop much better sleeping habits because of it. It could be that you're someplace where the light wakes you up all the time. And so what you could do is you could just buy blackout curtains and put them there one time, one purchase, one time you put them up, and now you can maybe have better sleeping habits because you have blackout curtains. Or it could just be remove the TV from your bedroom. So you stop watching screens when you fall asleep, and maybe the screens are actually causing you to be too stimulated. So remove the TV just the one time, it's going to make it really hard for you to watch television again if there's no TV in your bedroom. And finally, for productivity, a bunch of little habits here that could be developed just with one action. One thing is, for instance, you could just unsubscribe from email lists. So you go through your email and you decide, I'm going to unsubscribe to everything that keeps bombarding me with spam or whatever it is. Doing that once, unsubscribing from a list, will save you from all of the other work that you need to do to keep up with that email list, and also then developing better habits of productivity. You could turn off the notifications on your phone and maybe mute the group chat so you're not so responsive to every little social event that's happening via your phone. You could use email filters to clean up your inbox so that when you open up your inbox, you're not overwhelmed with tons and tons of emails. Your filters have already taken care of it for you. And by doing it just once, setting up those filters, you now maybe develop better habits with email. And finally, maybe the most difficult thing to do for a lot of people is just delete the games and other social apps and things that you don't really need to have on your phone. Just get rid of them. By removing them the one time, hitting delete, it makes it a lot harder for you to then play the game again later or check that social media app or whatever it is. So the simple act of doing that one thing of deleting something causes you then to have a whole bunch of new good behaviors or good habits that you would like to have. Finally, we're at the fourth step, which is the fourth simple rule here, which is to make it satisfying. Because remember, the idea here is that you want to repeat the habit, right? So habits are things that we repeat over and over again, and so we want to keep it satisfying. So I'll give you a really good example of this. This is an example that he talks about in his book about a group of health researchers that were in Karachi, Pakistan. And they were working in some neighborhoods there in which they had a lot of problems with lots of different kinds of viral and bacterial infections that were spreading through these neighborhoods and getting a lot of people sick. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that the water wasn't good. And one of the things that they noticed when they were observing these people is that so many of these Karachi residents in these neighborhoods just didn't actually wash their hands when they cleaned food, when they did different kinds of work, when they touched each other. And so they said, hey, we should work on this. Let's work on hand washing. And they talked to these residents in Karachi, and they actually found that nearly all of them knew that hand washing was actually good, but unfortunately, they just didn't engage in it as a habit. They didn't regularly wash their hands. In fact, as it says here, some people would just run their hands under the water quickly. Others would only wash one hand. Many would simply forget to wash their hands before preparing their food. But every person actually said that washing their hand was important, but few people had this as a habit. How could you overcome this? How could you make this particular habit more pleasing, more satisfying, so that people would actually want to do this more often? Well, they were working with a Procter & Gamble, a very large household goods company. And one of the things that they discovered was that these people were using a soap to wash their hands that they didn't actually find much pleasure in. It was a very smellless, kind of had no odor, didn't really suds up or anything. And what they found was that these people actually thought that Safeguard soap was a soap that was like premium to them, that it was like a sort of a luxury product. Because when they used Safeguard, they found that their hands would lather up more, had a really pleasant scent, and they actually enjoyed washing their hands. So what they did in this neighborhood, in these neighborhoods where they were working, is they went ahead and gave these residents Safeguard free for a year. So they gave them a free supply of Safeguard soap so they could wash their hands and have a chance to actually wash their hands. Now, what's interesting is they did that for a year of giving them free soap, and immediately everybody who got the free soap actually started washing their hands more. And you could just say, well, it's free soap, of course, that's why they're going to do it. But what's really interesting in this study that's talked about in Clear's book is that they came back 6 years later and they found that over 95% of the households who'd gotten the free soap after that first year continued to wash their hands, having really good washing stations for their hands. And it's not clear whether or not they were all buying Safeguard soap anymore, but they had just developed the habit enough in that 1 year when they had the free premium soap that they were now washing their hands more often. So you see, hand washing, a fairly innocuous habit that we all would like to regularly do, especially during these times of pandemics and so on, it could be made more pleasant, more pleasurable, and more satisfying, so it's more likely that you'd go and repeat it. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you develop a habit, there are different outcomes or consequences that occur at different times. Some of them are more short-term outcomes, like for instance, if I go to the gym on a regular basis, I might feel really tired and sweaty and yucky afterwards, right? So it's the short-term outcome. But if I keep doing that, even though I'm kind of sweaty and yucky in the short term, maybe in the long term, I'm healthier, I'm stronger, I feel more fit, right? So there's these short-term and these long-term gains, these long-term outcomes. We, as humans, tend to be very focused on immediate rewards. So we like having the immediate reward, and we have a really tough time with developing habits that have delayed outcomes, delayed positive rewards. You can tell yourself, hey, I'm going to study every night for 2 hours, and you could do that, but maybe there's no reward at the end of that. Like you have to wait until the end of the semester when you take the final exam to see that that all paid off, right? So there's no immediate reward perhaps by engaging in that regular habit. What is immediately rewarded then is repeated, and what is immediately punished is going to be avoided. So what can we do to turn our need for instant gratification into some sort of advantage? Well, one thing you can obviously do is find other ways of giving yourself rewards that are not directly related to the habit, but still maybe as a way for you to reward yourself for engaging in this habit that doesn't have any immediate short-term benefits. So for example, maybe you tell yourself that I'm going to study for 2 hours and then I'll reward myself with 20 minutes of YouTube videos. So yes, there are those obvious tricks you could do to go ahead and reward yourself. In fact, that's what the Pomodoro technique does, where you work for like 20 or 25 minutes focused on a task, and then you give yourself 5 minutes like to go out and stretch or to walk around or something, and then go back to work again for 20 or 25 minutes. The idea there is that you're not going to get the long-term reinforcement right away because you're working on this task that's going to take you a while to complete, but you can go ahead and break it up by chunking it to smaller bits and then giving yourself something pleasurable to do for 5 minutes or so before you go back to do your work. So that's one of the ways you can kind of negotiate this immediate versus delayed gratification. Another thing you can do is to think about a little bit about things that you're trying to change about your behavior so that you can make avoidance more rewarding itself. So let's say that, for instance, you're trying to diminish your spending on frivolous things like buying coffees that you don't need or going to see movies that you don't. So what you could do is you could go ahead and open up a bank account and call it something like the European trip. What happens then is every time you do have that cue that you want to go ahead and buy something or pay for that fancy coffee or whatever it is that you think of as a frivolous spending habit, you go ahead and reward yourself by avoiding that behavior, by putting the money that you would have spent on that frivolous spend into your bank account, into your European trip. So therefore, in the long term, you're going to get money collecting that goes towards your European trip, but you're reinforcing these things that you're trying to avoiding spending negative things, things that are frivolous that aren't going to help you in the long term. And so you got to head and turned it into something that's going to actually help. The last topic that I want to cover that's in this book is keeping track of your habits. And so habit tracking is, all the rage these days. There's all sorts of apps or little things on your watch that you can have that keep track of your habits. Is this all really good? Is it really good to track your habits? And the answer is yes, if you go back and look at those 4 simple rules. So for example, one of those is a benefit that has to do with that first simple rule, which is to make it obvious. By going ahead and turning something into something you track on a habit tracker, you're going to have that very obvious connection between a cue, like it was time to go to the gym and you went to the gym and you wrote it down that you did it. And that whole connection then becomes more salient, more in your mind, that you are consciously, deliberately making this connection between particular cues and the subsequent habit that you're trying to develop. So habit tracking makes everything really obvious. The second benefit is that habit tracking is attractive. And it's attractive because most of these habit trackers have a really fun element to them where they do things like, have a goal that you're trying to reach. It's really good to see that you're working towards that goal. You're going to get some pleasure out of it as you do it. And so the actual going through the habit becomes a pleasurable experience, something that's attractive that you want to do because you want to fill in that little box, or you want to see that ring get completed. And then likewise, a third benefit is just that there is this reward that comes with habit tracking, that you get to see yourself reaching those goals that you set for yourself. You see yourself completing all of your rings on your Apple Watch, or doing everything that you said you were going to do in terms of working on this particular assignment. So habit tracking has all of the elements, really, basically all of the 4 rules are in there, just to help you reinforce these habits and build them and make them stronger. So I highly recommend that you look into habit trackers when you are developing your own new habits. And the other thing you might want to do is consider having an accountability partner, somebody who you can go ahead and report your habits to. So this other person who's going to know that you have done your habit or not, and maybe they're interested in this because they're also working on the same habit. Maybe they're trying to go to the gym more often. Maybe they're trying to study more. Maybe they're trying to write more. For instance, I was in a writing group for several years, a bunch of academics. We got together and we would keep together and set goals for ourselves and try to develop good habits of writing a certain amount every day. And then we'd show up every Friday and report to each other how we had done. And that kind of reporting and having, again, social reinforcement, which is really, really important when you're developing habits, really help then to establish good writing habits. So that's all I have for this particular video. I hope that you consider getting Clear's book if you're interested in this topic. And if you also are really interested in just psychology and neuroscience and things in general, consider subscribing to my channel. I've got many more interesting videos lined up, and I'll be putting them out in the coming weeks. So thanks again for watching. Bye.